The year was 1815, and the world was holding its breath. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had reshaped Europe with his ambitions and armies, had escaped exile and returned to power. Now, at the heart of Europe, an army of nations prepared to meet him for what would be the final, bloody showdown, the Battle of Waterloo. Private William Barrett of the British Army was only 23 years old, but he had already seen the horrors of war. A farm boy from Somerset, he had joined the army seeking adventure and glory, inspired by tales of conquest and honor. But years of fighting across Europe had stripped him of those illusions. War was not glory. It was blood, death, and the haunting cries of wounded men. On the eve of the battle, the mood in the British camp was tense. Soldiers sat around campfires, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, each man silently contemplating what awaited them the next day. The sky above was heavy with the threat of rain, and the ground beneath their boots was already turning to mud. William sat with a small group of comrades, among them his closest friend, James Fletcher. James had joined the army with him, and together, they had survived campaigns in Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. They had grown from boys into men, brothers not by blood but by the bond forged in battle. "I heard the French are bringing everything they've got," James said, breaking the silence, his voice low. "The old guard, the cavalry, artillery, it's going to be a hell of a fight." William nodded, staring into the fire. "We've made it this far, haven't we? We'll make it through tomorrow." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. This was different. The stakes were higher than ever. If Napoleon won, all of Europe could fall under his control again. The next morning, the battle began in earnest. The sky was dark with clouds, and the rain had turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud. The sound of drums echoed across the plains, signaling the advance. William's heart pounded in his chest as he and his comrades stood in formation, muskets at the ready. As the French army marched toward them, a sea of blue uniforms and gleaming bayonets, the ground shook beneath their feet. The air was filled with the deafening roar of cannon fire, and the smell of gunpowder was thick in the air. "Steady, lads!" shouted their officer, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Hold the line!" The French artillery unleashed a barrage of cannonballs, tearing through the British ranks. Men were thrown into the air, limbs shattered, blood soaking the muddy ground. William gripped his musket tighter, his knuckles white with fear, but there was no time to think. The French were charging. "Fire!" came the order. A volley of musket fire erupted from the British lines, cutting down the first wave of French soldiers. But still, they came. The French cavalry thundered across the field, their horses kicking up clods of mud as they charged the British lines. William fired his musket, the recoil jolting through his body. He reloaded as fast as he could, the movements automatic after years of practice. To his right, James was doing the same, his face grim but focused. They had been through this before, but this felt different. The sheer size of the French army, the relentless pressure, it was as if the entire weight of Napoleon's empire was bearing down on them. Suddenly, a cannonball whizzed past, narrowly missing William but striking James in the chest. The force of the impact threw him backward, and he collapsed onto the muddy ground. William's heart stopped. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees beside his friend. "James, James, stay with me," William shouted, his voice raw with desperation. But James was already gone, his lifeless eyes staring up at the stormy sky. For a moment, the battle seemed to disappear. The noise, the smoke, the screams of the dying, all of it faded into the background as William knelt beside his fallen friend. They had survived so much together, only for it to end here, on this godforsaken field in Belgium. Grief and rage surged through William, but he had no time to mourn. The French were advancing again, and the British line was starting to buckle under the pressure. He grabbed James's musket and stood, his hands shaking but his mind set on one thing: survival. He had to survive this, for James, for all the men who had already fallen. As the day wore on, the battle raged with a ferocity unlike anything William had ever seen. The French threw everything they had at the British, but the line held. The arrival of the Prussian army late in the afternoon turned the tide of the battle. Together, the British and Prussians pushed back Napoleon's forces. By evening, the battlefield was a wasteland of mud, bodies, and broken weapons. The French army had been defeated, and Napoleon's reign of terror was finally over. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Thousands of men lay dead or dying, their lives sacrificed for the fate of Europe. Exhausted and covered in mud, William wandered the battlefield, searching for any survivors from his unit. The ground was littered with the dead, both friend and foe, but all he could think about was James. His friend, his brother, was gone, taken by the same war that had taken so many others. As the sun set over the blood-soaked plains of Waterloo, William stood alone, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. He had survived, but at what cost? The glory he had once sought felt hollow now, overshadowed by the loss of his comrades. In the days that followed, the British army celebrated their victory, but William could find no joy in it. He had fought for king and country, but all he had left were memories of the friends he had lost. The drums of war had finally fallen silent, but their echoes would haunt him for the rest of his life.